Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today is October 7th, and this episode is going to be very eventful. In this episode, on Putin's birthday, children are writing him poems, and ChatGPT has also written him a poem, which he probably won't like very much. Let's listen. Russia has finally admitted whose drones are flying over Europe, and meanwhile Ukrainians, pretending to be Russians, are supposed to blow up ships in Europe. This is a new statement from Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. And what does China have to do with it? We'll talk about that too. Europe is cutting off Russian diplomats and spies, while Trump has made a decision regarding Tomahawks. But there's one nuance. We'll talk about this and more in today's episode. There will be a lot of interesting things, especially if this is your first time on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. So Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has decided to overachieve in producing nonsense. And just recently, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service reported that Ukraine is preparing a terrible provocation, namely that it wants to send, attention, a Russian-Belarusian sabotage and reconnaissance group, SRG, into Polish territory. And this group was supposed to make some noise, simulate an attack on critical infrastructure, and then surrender and tell European intelligence services that they were hired by Putin. In this way, NATO was supposed to get agitated and take more active measures against Russia. Why this group was supposed to be a joint Russian-Belarusian one is still unclear. I don't know really. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, whenever they come up with something, you just end up wondering, why is it like that? I mean, why jointly? They might as well suggest coming across the Polish border wearing kokoshniks so that everything is immediately obvious, with bears. And Balaleikas, just so it's clear right away, there they are, the Russian sabotage group. But that's what happened recently. The head of the SVR, Naryshkin, decided to go even further and now meet the new version from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. Let me remind you, all of this is published on their official website. They even have a special section there, SVR reports, or SVR is authorized to report. So how about this? So, my little viewer, get ready. You're about to embark on an exciting journey because Uncle Naryshkin has been brought some potent magic powder and he's come up with a fantastic fairy tale just for you. Listen, my little viewer, Russia's foreign intelligence has accused the United Kingdom of preparing an attack by Kremlin agents on a ship in one of Europe's ports. The British authorities, I'm quoting this directly from their official website, the British authorities are enraged by their failed attempts to defeat Russia and are preparing yet another vile provocation against Moscow. In other words, a group of Russians fighting on Ukraine's side, traitors, are supposed to carry out an attack on a Ukrainian Navy ship or a civilian vessel in one of the European ports. That's the correct way to put it. Now, for those of you who have already prepared your DAL dictionaries, just set them aside for now. No need to throw them at me. After these saboteurs are discovered, they will claim that they were acting on orders from Moscow. So, basically, it's the same group in striped kokoshniks that was supposed to enter Poland, but didn't. In other words, Russians who are fighting for Ukraine. They pretend to be Russians who are fighting for Putin, blow up a ship, military or civilian, in a European port, then surrender and say, Putin hired us. Basically, yes. And then Naryshkin goes on, saying that London is counting on the rabidly Russophobic European political elite to eagerly swallow this fake story about malicious Kremlin agents. At the same time, and this is where China comes in, as mentioned at the beginning, according to the Russian intelligence service, the saboteurs are supposed to be equipped with Chinese-made underwater gear. This equipment is supposed to be presented as ironclad proof that China is supporting Russia's war against Ukraine, the SVR added. Well, let's put it this way. First of all, here, 20 Russian drones flew into Poland and somehow there wasn't much of a reaction. Well, NATO Russian drones entered. So what can we say if somewhere in a European port something happens to a Ukrainian boat or to some cargo ship? What will really happen then? What will NATO do? And the saboteurs will surrender, saying, yes, Putin hired us. That is, several investigations in Europe have now shown that the Russian GRU is behind the sabotage and arson at postal terminals. And so what? And what is the reaction? Well, now, the main question is, what is actually restraining Narishkin? How was all of this supposed to look? A group in striped kokoshniks swims up to a cargo ship, starts firing at it with Chinese blasters while singing Gazmanov songs, then surrenders to British Special Forces and says that old man Kabayev himself sent them on the mission. I look at this whole Kremlin gang. Putin, Patrushev, Narishkin, they're just senile madmen, paranoiacs and sadists. A thirst to dominate, to prove themselves through force, to assert themselves at the expense of those they consider weak. In short, they're just fascist thugs, and they already realize their time is almost up. Officially, Putin turns 73 today. In 25 years of Putin's rule, Russia has learned only one thing. The only thing they can produce is weapons. Or rather, that's all they are capable of producing. Maybe there are some good Russian cars that people buy around the world. Maybe someone knows of any good Russian smartphones. Maybe there's some kind of Russian electronics out there. The GDP of the Russian Federation is less than that of the state of Texas. I keep talking about this all the time. For them, the event of the decade was Ovechkin's goal-scoring record. Ovechkin, who has long since lived in the US, in the state of Virginia, and plays for the Washington Capitals. For them, that's really the event of the decade. When did Russia and Russians suddenly decide that they are great? Russia is not great, it's just big. But soon, apparently, China will adjust that notion. By the way, about Putin's birthday today, you know, when you're walking down the street somewhere in Ukraine or sitting somewhere and someone is reading the news and they say, when will it finally die? No one ever really asks who it is. Everyone knows perfectly well. So let's wish today that Ukrainians' wish comes true as soon as possible. By the way, on Putin's birthday, an incident happened in Russia that will now fully show you what Russia under Putin is like. In the Yakut city of Pokrovsk, on Putin's birthday, they suddenly declare a day of mourning. This was done by the new mayor of Pokrovsk. Of course, people immediately suspected him of trying to show disagreement with the central government, to score some political points, or wondered if he was an oppositionist and so on. It seemed everything was much simpler. This day of mourning was connected to the arrival in Pokrovsk of a special flight carrying residents of the city who died in the war. Imagine Pokrovsk, a town of 10,000 people. It has a population of 10,000. And then a special flight arrives carrying 200 corpses who died ingloriously, some of them whole, some in pieces. This is what Putin's Russia is all about. He declared a day of mourning. And why? Because 200 bodies arrived from the war in a small town. This is what Russia is all about. It's some kind of creepy Balabanov-style nightmare. And of course, all across Russia, they're forcing children to write birthday greetings to Putin, little poems, drawings, and so on. And we, together with ChatGPT, also decided to make a quatrain. So here's what ChatGPT suggested to me as a children's birthday greeting for Putin. Uncle Vova, happy birthday. We send you our congratulations. You've already lived your life. Go for a review. You've earned it. Well done. But let me remind you, ChatGPT learns from you. So the way you teach it is the way it will formulate things. Well, something like that. Of course, it's very useful, but I really like this little 4-line poem. By the way, lately, Russian bots have been swarming under my videos in droves. You ban one network and another one shows up literally a few minutes later. So you might encounter a lot of them here, and that's a good thing. Let them leave comments too. Do you know what their main message is? For every event, Ukraine destroyed a major oil refinery, the Sverdlov plant, something else, and something else again. For every event they write, actually, you're all lying. It's Russia striking Ukraine. Billions, trillions of Ukrainians are dying at the front. Everything is lost. You should have surrendered to Putin earlier, and so on. Let me put it this way. When you're winning, you don't need to convince anyone of it. It's obvious as it is. For example, when Ukrainians drove the Russians out of Kherson, from near Kiev, from the Kharkiv region with all sorts of rags, no one needed to explain anything to anyone about who drove whom out. But here, clearly something is going wrong, yet they're still trying to influence public opinion somehow. But you, by the way, immediately Don't respond, just check the registration date. They're usually registered from an hour to a few days ago. So don't waste your energy on them. And now they bring out the press secretary, this so-called Botox tiger, and Peskov, once again rolling his eyes, tells us that Russia is not to blame for anything. There are no grounds whatsoever. The Kremlin urged people not to believe that Russia is launching drones at Europe. Well, of course, it's Bangladesh launching them. And as that Russian villain said, remember in the movie Red Heat? We're not guilty of anything. What proof do you have? Then Arnold, broke off that prosthetic and dumped out what was inside and said a word that could get you in trouble here. He said it was a banned substance. So basically Peskov says, what proof do you have that Russia isn't launching any drones over Germany, Denmark, Norway, or anywhere at all? In Poland, those are ours too, but not really ours. By the way, the same foreign intelligence service reported that it was Ukraine that intercepted several Russian drones, is now packing them with explosives and will launch them into Europe. So Russia is preparing for this, for the fact that they're going to do something nasty, but it'll look like a false flag operation. They could blow up some ship in European ports right now. They could do something else as well. Or they could launch a real combat drone and say, see, we told you so. In other words, you can't expect anything good from them. So even now, the Russians are telling us, or rather telling the Europeans, we're not there. There are no Russian drones, it's not us. We've heard this before. Remember, when the annexation of Crimea began, Russians without insignia invaded there and immediately seized military facilities. Putin said that there were no Russian troops in Ukraine. At the time, he said those were some local self-defense units, those little green men, local self-defense units, and that you could buy camouflage in any store. So basically, we're not there. That was in March 2014. Exactly a year later, in the documentary Crimea, The Way Home, a truly exceptional piece of propaganda trash. This was March 2015, exactly a year later. For the first time, Putin publicly admitted that the little green men were actually Russian soldiers. And then he said, of course, behind the self-defense forces stood our servicemen. Such blatant nonsense, the likes of which the world has never seen. It seems to me he simply doesn't know how not to lie. He just can't. Friends, let me remind you that we are currently running an important fundraiser for the 101st Brigade to acquire termite ground robotic systems. These are evacuation drones that help evacuate our wounded soldiers. They transport them to a safe area where medics can take care of them. In other words, they save the lives of medics who no longer have to drive under shell fire and shrapnel to pick up the wounded. And they save the life of the soldier who is quickly transported to a safe zone by this evacuation vehicle. That's why I'm really asking you to join in and help with this fundraiser. The soldiers of the 101st Brigade have recorded a message for us.
We, the soldiers of the 101st Security Brigade, are reaching out to Boris Tizengauzen and his followers for help. We are very grateful to you for the drones you have previously provided. At present, we are in urgent need of 2 termite ground robotic systems for the rapid and timely evacuation of the wounded from the battlefield, which, in the current situation, will allow us to save their lives. Our units are fighting in the Kostiantynivka direction and in Chasiv Yar. We continue to destroy the enemy and believe in your support. Glory to Ukraine!
On their brigade's Facebook page, there's a series of posts called Hero Stories, where they share the life stories of those who are currently fighting in the brigade. People have completely different backgrounds and destinies. When you read these stories, you realize just how stupid you had to be to come and try to defeat these people to go to war with Ukraine. That was his main miscalculation. Ukraine will be the lid that slams down on him once and for all. And forever. There are many life stories there. For example, today I read the story of one of our defenders with the call sign Batya. He has 4 children, is 52 years old, went through the ATO and is now fighting in the Donetsk direction. And his eldest son is fighting in the Kupiansk area. So when you read about him, you see he's just the salt of the earth, a real rock, a pillar. Let's help the 101st Brigade. The link to donate is in the description of this video and also in the comments. There are options for Mono Private and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you, from myself, from our soldiers, and I always try to pass on your kind words to them from all of us. If you don't see the payment details here, there's a Monobank QR code right here that leads directly to this fundraiser. Trump stated that he has almost made a decision about supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. The decision to supply Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles has almost been made, said US President Donald Trump. Here's a quote for you. Yes, I have almost made a decision to a large extent, if you think about it. He said this while speaking with journalists. He noted that before the deliveries begin, he wants to find out how these missiles will be used and where the armed forces are planning to direct them. At the same time, Trump emphasized that he does not want an escalation of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Well, we've already talked about this with you. Maybe there's something we don't know. But even if the decision is made, Tomahawk missiles are launched from launchers. Most often these are ships and submarines, and no one is going to give those to us for sure. Well, they can also be launched from the air, but strategic bombers are also unlikely to be provided to us by anyone. There are 2 ground-based launchers from which Tomahawk missiles can be launched, but they are not being offered. That is the Typhoon complex. Both are located in the US. The one that was in Germany is without launchers, and as far as I know, it only has a command vehicle but not a launcher. And just having a launcher is not enough. In other words, the whole system needs to be supplied. So the entire system includes 4 launchers, a command vehicle, a reloading vehicle, and various support vehicles, and so on. Do you think the US is ready to provide Ukraine with this latest technology? There are a lot of questions, a lot. So, regarding whether or not they will provide the Tomahawk, maybe somewhere in secret factories these launchers have already been produced in greater numbers. Then anything is possible. But overall, there are many questions, including from military experts who are asking how will it actually be launched. And Denmark apparently did not believe Peskov and decided to tighten control over tankers in its territorial waters.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
In response to the fact that unknown drones, whose ownership is unclear, are flying over their airports and military bases, Denmark will step up inspections of oil tankers in its territorial waters as part of the fight against Russia's shadow fleet. Excellent. We must stop Putin's war machine. We are using all available means, said Denmark's Minister for Business, Morten Budskov. Well, that's what Bloomberg is reporting. And last week, let me remind you, the President of France called on European allies to detain suspicious tankers. And he called this extremely important. With increased pressure on the shadow fleet, the tanker was then released along with the captain and the chief mate. They simply let the tanker go. Well, it was detained for a day or 2, which is already good, as it disrupts logistics chains. In the Kremlin, they responded that they would take measures if this scenario is implemented, and also threatened with unpredictable consequences for global energy markets. What's interesting about this? How can Russia alone influence global energy markets? They are now clashing with OPEC because they are increasing production, and Russia is having more and more crude oil. Do you know why? Because Ukraine destroys Russian oil refineries with its drones. They can't process the oil, so they're forced to dump more crude oil onto the market. And OPEC is also operating there. Let me remind you, regarding these tanker detentions, Putin unfortunately still has a few more cards up his sleeve. For example, environmental blackmail, which I talked about in detail yesterday. That is already documented cases. There have been several cases of oil spills by the Shadow Fleet's tankers. And no one can say yet which of them were due to accidental technical malfunctions and which were deliberate. I can easily imagine that Denmark will now be told, if you suddenly start detaining our tankers, one of them might just happen to spring a leak somewhere in your straits. And between 100 and 150,000 tons of oil, or fuel oil, would simply wipe out all the flora and fauna along the coast and in the water. So it's better not to do that. Could that happen? It could. And here, you see, again, it's not our fault. Well, the tanker was old. What can you do? A missile hit the country. That's just the situation that happened. These are typical Russian methods. Remember how Simonian, the Russian propagandist, suggested detonating a nuclear bomb over Siberia? To shut down the internet for the entire planet. That's their approach. We don't live well ourselves, and we won't let you either. But for you, dear Europeans, losing your comfort is scarier than it is for Russians. And what do Russians have to fear losing? Just take a look at how people live in Adygea, Tuva, Chuvashia, Mariel, Yakutia, Chita, Norilsk. Look, there's no war going on there. But it looks as if there really had been one, and as if an epidemic swept through afterwards. The streets there really look post-apocalyptic, and the zombies walking around are Russians. That's all there is to it. What do they have to lose? Recently, I was looking for information about a Russian occupier who was killed in Ukraine, and I came across a photo from this ghoul's funeral in his hometown. So just to give you an idea, the funeral procession is going on, gray sky, the whole funeral scene is in some kind of gray dark tones, their faces are the same color, mud up to their knees, just a crowd of zombie-like, drunken fellow villagers trudging to the cemetery, because afterwards they can have a shot of vodka. The only happy face is the fat priest from the Russian Orthodox Church leading this zombie parade. All around is poverty, crooked huts and houses, mud, hopelessness and decay. Tell me, what do they have to lose? What else do they have to lose? For example, for most people, losing their life is terrifying, right? There is such a thing as the instinct for self-preservation. But they are ready to go and die for money. So even that instinct for self-preservation is already blocked in them. Out there in the backwoods where this procession is happening, there are only two options. You can either die from low-quality surrogate alcohol. Just recently, there was a case where 40 people died at once under a bench from fake alcohol, or you can die in the war. But if you die under a bench, Putin won't pay your family millions, but if you die there, he will. Of course, that's how they choose, but still, they have to keep raising the stakes. Once again, this month in some regions, they have significantly increased the payments for those who go to war. Why? Because now, even for big money, people don't want to go. Recently, one of the Russian war correspondents complained that the average lifespan of a Russian assault soldier is 12 days. That's about how it is. By the way, friends, there was another pleasant event just yesterday. We delivered 5 GTI Matrice 30T drone units to our legendary 3rd Assault Brigade. Here's what it looked like. By the way, I was actually surprised myself. They're really not small at all. We talked with our soldiers. They send you all huge greetings and gratitude. Well, I took the liberty of passing on all your regards to them. Kind words. There were a couple of interesting moments when we started talking about how these drones aren't small at all. It's like a really serious suitcase. We remembered the vampire drones, the ones we also delivered, and then there's the hexacopter, which is just huge. People call it Baba Yaga, and it comes in this massive case, so heavy that one person can't lift it alone. And Stas from the 3rd Assault Brigade says that when they bring in the vampires, or the Maguras, it feels like you're a rock star about to go on tour. I asked, why is that? He says, well, because there are these crates, and they're really huge crates, like stage equipment cases, black boxes with aluminum corners, with those aluminum latches and locks. So I thought, well, he means it figuratively, right? It's actually really cool, and every time I talk to them, they're so genuine. Many of them are really modest people. And I think, what kind of comparison is that? Like a rock star, I'm getting ready for a concert. Here come the Magurs, the vampires have arrived, and these boxes are standing there. I mean, I thought that's actually a really accurate description of concerts. I mean, they put on these concerts for those ghouls with the help of vampires and other drones, with fire shows, with holy fire from the sky. So it's all just like at a real concert. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. There are a lot of us, and there will be even more. The more of us there are, the more people will learn the truth. This is important. And among European politicians, a serious battle is brewing. First, Angela Merkel gave an interview and stated that Poland and the Baltic countries are apparently also to blame, including for the fact that Putin attacked Ukraine. Supposedly, Merkel, came up with these Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. I'll tell you this. Okay, let me finish. Sometimes I get like this. After these Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, she came up with some new format for direct negotiations with Putin, but Poland and the Baltic countries did not support it. I'll be honest with you, I studied this Minsk agreement and, well, it was impossible to understand how it was supposed to work at all, just unreal. It was probably written that way on purpose, like in the Soviet Union they taught English. For several years they teach you with textbooks and English classes, 7th grade, 6th, 5th, 10th, and so on. It seems like you've been studying English for so many years, but you still can't say anything. You meet a native speaker. In exactly the same way, Minsk was prescribed as a program for learning English in the Soviet Union. Moreover, Merkel gave that interview where she said they're all basically jerks. She gave the interview to a Hungarian publication. Lately, we've had a lot of Hungarian publications, sources for Russia, and so Merkel went there. Well, after that, she really got an earful. That is, to quote, she has blood on her hands. She'd be better off keeping quiet. That's how both Polish officials and those from the Baltic countries responded to her. The former Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said that she actually lobbied for the Nord Streams, so she should keep quiet, and his party colleague Adam Bielan stated that it's her who has blood on her hands, so she'd be better off staying silent. All in all, European politicians responded to Ms. Merkel quite mildly, because you could add more than just the Nord Streams to the list. That is, it was precisely under Merkel that Germany became the main lobbyist for Russian gas pipelines. That's a fact. Who increased Europe's energy dependence? Who bought more and more Russian gas every year? It's clear. By the way, there's another figure we haven't heard from in a long time. What about former Chancellor Schröder? He's the one who set everything in motion from the very beginning. And he did it so brazenly that everyone was just stunned at the time. Let me just remind you. It's an amazing story of incredible luck and coincidences. In 2005, just weeks before leaving office, Chancellor Schröder signs an agreement to build Nord Stream. And just 2 weeks after stepping down, literally just a couple of months later, he became the head of the Nord Stream Shareholders Committee, which is controlled by Russian Gazprom. There was a huge scandal about it, well, aside from the scandal itself. The abandonment of nuclear energy. That was also done by Merkel. The dismantling of the Bundeswehr, the reduction and elimination. That too. A soft policy, a policy of concessions to the Kremlin since 2014. That too. Holding Ukraine back. They blocked arms deliveries to Kyiv. Merkel, thank you. And under Merkel, German business became deeply integrated into Russian projects. Some don't even know how to get out now. And finally, perhaps the most important plus, in quotes of course, of Mrs. Merkel. It's the crisis she brought and imposed, I mean the migrant crisis. Now it's practically a problem for all of Europe. So who planted this bomb under the European Union? So if I were Merkel, I'd keep quiet. I'd just sit quietly like this, keeping to myself. The Komsomol activists shouldn't be exposing themselves so actively. And by the way, it's not just Merkel. There was also the lack of a tough response in 2008 after Russia invaded Georgia. Then came the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Donbass. There were some kind of light sanctions, super mild sanctions. Thanks to Barack Obama for that. So yes, indeed, there are a great many wonderful people to sincerely thank here for how this rather unremarkable, small and unassuming little rat truly grew up, or rather, quite remarkably, didn't grow up at all, instead remaining precisely the same diminutive size, but nevertheless developed truly grand and expansive imperial ambitions that really just sprouted up quite vigorously and uncontrollably like wild, untamed weeds. And now they've decided to tighten the screws a bit on Russian diplomats in Europe. They finally agreed to restrict the movement of Russian diplomats within the Schengen zone. I was curious about how they would control this. So, according to the new rule, which will be included in the 19th sanctions package, Russian diplomats, for example, if one is assigned to France and wants to go to a neighboring country, must notify the government of that country that they intend to travel there. But the main question is, who and how will this be controlled? After all, there are no border checkpoints between countries in the European Union, so how will they enforce this? Well, yes, he could just get into a car with non-diplomatic plates so as not to attract attention or something like that. So, how exactly are you going to control this? Actually, the main question isn't so much about how they'll control it, but rather how they'll punish someone if they get caught. That's what's really important, because as practice has shown, it doesn't really matter what sanctions you impose, matters less than how you enforce them. And it's also important to hit hard those intermediaries who help Russia circumvent sanctions. And as for you, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, subscribe to this channel, and let's help our soldiers from the 101st Brigade. The details are in the description of this video. Have a peaceful day, everyone, and glory to Ukraine.